Oh my, what a wonderful introduction, Trish. Thank you so much for that. And also Cliff for the reflection. And I think it's very pertinent to our remarks today. It's really a pleasure to be here with you again. It'd be more of a pleasure if we could get together. But as Trish mentioned, I'm really grateful to you all for continuing the precautions. As the mother of a COVID doctor, I know how necessary it is. And I'm glad that you have found these ways to continue the community by Zoom and to continue the education process, which has to do a little bit with what we're going to talk about today. You know, many of you have watched in alarm as the small state of Guanajuato, where you live, has taken first place in the number of homicides in the nation. Guanajuato had registered almost 4,000 assassinations last year, and it's above El Estado de Mexico and Chihuahua, which have traditionally been among the most violent states in the country, especially since the drug war was launched. The number of homicides has continued to go up in the country despite the promise of a change in policy. There were 36,579 last year, and the number has been around there at an all-time high for the past 3 years. It's looking like we'll see this about the same thing this year as well. The violence has really affected day-to-day life for many people, as I'm sure it has for all of you, although fortunately not directly as victims. The last time I think it was that I was there, we heard the entire drama play out: a shot, a cry, the sirens, the weeping, not blocks away from where we were at the time. We know the overall cause: a rivalry, a turf war between a local cartel and an expanding national one. But what does that really tell us about the dynamics of violence in daily life, and more importantly, about the way out of these cycles? In late July, the foreign minister, Marcelo Ebrard, stated to the Washington Post that the Merida Initiative is dead. The Merida Initiative, many of you will recall, is the United States aid package that was developed by the George Bush administration to support Mexico's war on drugs, in turn announced by then President Felipe Calderon in December of 2006. The Bush administration developed this 3-year aid package to support the Mexican war. And again, war is the operative word, as Cliff reminded us. And really the most important part for us to begin a questioning of this policy that's had such dreadful results over the past almost 15 years now. And the aid package provided equipment that you would typically associate with the war. It provided helicopters, small planes, for attacks and interceptions, surveillance equipment, and massive intelligence system that we're now seeing has been used against opposition members by the Peña Nieto government in the famous case of the Pegasus spy equipment that was purchased from Israel. And the stated reason was a recognition that the United States has a shared responsibility in the plight of drug trafficking, illegal drug trafficking through Mexico, and the strength of the cartels. The United States, as the major market for prohibited drugs, a very small proportion actually stay and are consumed in Mexico. The Mexican market is really of little interest relatively to the large cartels. And therefore, they argued they had a responsibility to help Mexico to reduce the power of the cartel. Now, this would make perfect sense. Obviously, the United States does have a responsibility, except that instead of assuming responsibility for the part of the transnational crime that takes place within US territory, which is the size and the perseverance of the market for prohibited drugs, money laundering, and financial crimes, as well as the trafficking of arms to cartels and the problematic use and addiction in the United States, there was no corresponding commitment to resolve these issues in the United States. So in addition to supporting a weak president, Calderon, who arguably stole the election, the United States government bolstered the drug war as a pretext for extending its own security perimeters. This is something we've been seeing since the War on Terror, and again, why it's pertinent to mention that here. And they saw an opportunity under the pretext of the war on drugs to have a far greater participation in the national security apparatus of their closest neighbor, obviously, along with Canada, and a neighbor that had presented more potential security threats, according to national security advisors within the United States. This was kind of a dream come true for the Pentagon, because there'd been a lot of resistance. The pre-government had been closely aligned to the United States on economic issues and many other issues, but because it came from a more nationalist past, there was a lot of reticence to allowing the Pentagon, allowing the United States government to have active participation in the Mexican national security, so that the presence and the participation of, say, the DEA, ATF, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, FBI, CIA, was much more limited than it was when Felipe Calderon opened the door with the war on drugs and the initiative and the Merida initiative began. They came in, US agents at that point began to come into Mexico in far greater numbers than they had been before, to apply this war on drugs model that was developed in the United States, and that basically, in this, of course, I'm simplifying, had to do with taking out the leaders of the drug cartels in order to weaken them, in what's called by the DEA the kingpin strategy. We've seen this happen. There have been a number of arrests and assassination of cartel leaders throughout the entire period of the drug war, and what we have not seen is any weakening of the cartels, and what we have seen as well has been a huge increase, a spike in violence within Mexico during this time. With the expansion, the United States took over an entire building on Reforma in addition to the embassy itself. And now they are in the process of building, it's been a long process, one of the largest embassies in the entire world in Mexico, which is primarily dedicated to this war on drugs strategy that's been shared. We've talked a lot about the results. There's been, like I said, around more than 36,000 homicides a year. This is total homicides. There's no division that we can make. We can just watch the tendencies. But to get a baseline, before the war on drugs was launched, there were approximately between 2,000 and 5,000 homicides a year. So a great deal of that is attributable to the policy itself. And while the homicides have stayed relatively stable over these years, including the pandemic years, what we've seen is a steady rise in femicides. This has caused a great deal of tension between the López Obrador government and feminist organizations throughout the country, who state that they are not doing enough to control the femicides within the country that are also related to this overall situation of violence. Then we also have to take into consideration, when we're looking at the results themselves, that the most recent announcement is that there are over 90,000 people who are disappeared or not located. Basically, there's two different categories. 90,000 people who are disappeared. That often has to do with the fact that drug cartels, again, in the context of the war on drugs, began to disappear bodies instead of leaving them out in the open. This is a huge tragedy for the families themselves, because it leaves them in this terrible limbo of not knowing what happened to their relatives. And that's why we have these very large victims organizations that are out searching with shovels for bones, or searching in prisons and morgues, trying to find relatives in processes that could take years and oftentimes are not successful. This is the overall situation that we have since this took place. When Marcelo Ebrard announced that the Merida Initiative was over then, it was in the context of the fact that the Lopez Obrador government has said that they will not continue from the beginning, from the campaign, with the war on drugs strategy, that public safety, public security is going to be the first priority within their government. The problem with that is that we have not seen the kinds of changes that we expect if there were a deeper strategy change in the war on drugs. And we haven't seen the changes that we would expect in the US-Mexico relationship in security either. The last time, which was right before the election, that I went to talk with a group to people within the US Embassy. First of all, they were openly against the election of Lopez Obrador, which gives you an idea of the overall attitude, like this is part of, we're in charge here, kind of. But when you first walk into the embassy offices, there's a big plaque of the Merida Initiative. And the Merida Initiative is the strategy, the binational strategy that basically takes precedent over any other aspect of the binational relationship since it was launched in 2008 with the first funding. I don't know if it's still there, but from the way that the actions of the US agents within Mexico, it appears that they're continuing with that same strategy. One of the key incidents that gave us an idea that the Mexican government is at least trying to change that was the aborted capture of Ovidio Guzman, the son of El Chapo, on October 17th in the year 2019 in Culiacan, Sinaloa. The operation and the messaging were a mess. They did manage to capture him, and as many people will recall, he was then released when there was a massive mobilization of the Sinaloa cartel blocking off entries to Culiacan, which is their stronghold, and threatening an all-out war if Ovidio was not released. And there was also a lot of muddledness, regarding who was making decisions there, made the decision that it was not worth it to risk the public safety, and Ovidio was released. There was a lot of criticism, especially from a kind of a macho point of view of this decision, but that's the correct decision if there's truly a change in the logic of the war on drugs, because it was weighed at that moment that there was this threat to public safety that went beyond the justice goals of capturing someone who was actually captured because as a result of an arrest order issued in Washington, D.C., another sign of how Mexican public policy is responding to signals, from Washington, which has caused a lot of criticisms in terms of national security of this strategy as well. The head of the public security at the time, Durazo, came out and said one thing, the armed forces said another. The presidential message was unclear at the beginning, but then President Lopez Obrador stood by that decision, claiming that it was for public safety. What's happened since then has been less clear in terms of this hugs, not bullets strategy of Lopez Obrador. We do see the longer term social programs that are aimed at reducing the ability of the drug cartels to recruit in communities, to recruit young people who are at risk, to recruit others who have no other economic options, but we're also seeing the advance rather than a retreat of militarization within the country, and this has become a huge concern. First of all, there was a formation of the National Guard. As many people will remember, there was a lot of participation. Actually, the government opened up participation from civil society, and civil society groups were able to get a commitment that the National Guard would only exist for 5 years before turning over public safety tasks to the police, who are in the process of being reformed, and that it would be under civilian control rather than military control by being part of public security. None of that has actually panned out. There's a new proposal to change the National Guard to be directly under the Army, the Secretary of Defense, by the President Lopez Obrador, and there's also been very little progress in creating police forces that would be in a position to be ready to take over from the National Guard. Instead, we've seen the armed deployment of the National Guard on the borders, in large part in response to demands from the United States. And they continue to participate almost identically, mostly run by military members, almost the exact same way as any of the armed forces would participate in the drug war. There's a high number of statements of complicity with the drug cartels and violations of human rights. National organizations, international organizations, human rights organizations have been very clear that a nation should not have the armed forces in charge of public security issues, and that Mexico, in particular, there are recommendations that they should withdraw the armed forces. But this administration has fostered a very close relationship with the armed forces, and the use of the National Guard increasingly under the control of the military in the drug war for public safety has been part of the concessions that are made for the armed forces for reasons that we don't entirely know, but that have actually, as I mentioned, advanced the militarization within the country. From a feminist analysis, what happens to a society that is in large part run by the armed forces, a very patriarchal institution, is that you have a top-down, potentially authoritarian system, and you also begin to lose the social fabric by not involving civilian and growing civil society to respond to these social programs. You have a situation in many ways like Afghanistan, where competing armies rule the country for so long that there isn't a strong social fabric that is able to build peace at any point, or when the military control breaks down. And that's a point that we'll come back to. So what has to change? There are very, very strong powers involved in the current strategy that has created the inertia that we've seen today, despite the declarations from the Lopez Obrador government. The Pentagon is heavily invested in the Merida Initiative. It now is not part of it formally because they diverted military aid into a separate category to kind of make it less transparent. But through NORTHCOM, through SOUTHCOM, through military training, and through supposed retired military that are operating in Mexico, it's very involved in Mexican security and will not let go of that easily. The US arms and security industry is obviously very involved as well. The US government has greatly benefited from Mexico's kind of allowing the US government to be part of its security and to extend its security perimeter in this way. It's very important to say that these are not the same interests as you would see if we were talking about the US people. You know, the extension of a security perimeter and the militarization of Mexico is certainly not in the interests of the US people, but it corresponds to this national security doctrine that has been put in place since the War on Terror, that has really pitted the national security elite within the country against the interests of people everywhere, and also feeds into, you know, the kind of mass incarceration and social control measures that we've seen from the Patriot Act on down within the United States. It's in the interest of private investment because it also relates to protecting private investment from social protests for the environmental and social impacts, what we've called arming NAFTA within Mexico. I want to go straight then to what some of the solutions are, although I do need to mention very quickly that the Biden administration, although it has indicated a change in a war on drugs strategy in the United States, Joe Biden has been a drug warrior since under the Obama administration, and it was the Obama administration that extended Bush's 3-year Merida initiative into an indefinite initiative. And although much of the military equipment was then siphoned into training programs, including for justice and police reform, we never saw a real change in strategy between Merida 1 and what they called Merida 2. The first important step would be decriminalizing. This is happening in Mexico and in the United States. In Mexico, there's a decriminalization of marijuana law. In the United States, we've seen marijuana decriminalization, legalization advance in many states. This eliminates the black market, in short. And so the enormous illicit financial flows are chipped away at as they're brought into a legal economy, and we're able to treat problematic use with a more health basis. This also reduces the pseudo-moral discourse that was dehumanizing anyone associated with the prohibited drug trade, whether it's people who produce it in Mexico, many times very poor peasants who have no other options, some of the most vulnerable sectors, people who transit it, mules, oftentimes women who carry drugs because they need money to feed their children, youth that have no education opportunities or employment opportunities that are asked to be lookouts or to somehow work for the cartels, and begins to open the door for policies that can actually help these people. Some of the social programs are directed toward these sectors, but as Cliff mentioned, they're long-term. So the decriminalization is very important. The humane treatment for those involved in the underground drug market, as I mentioned. The third would be transforming this highly militarized strategy into an effective peace strategy. And that means demilitarization. We've been talking about this on the TV show. There's a new, very detailed report out from the Pro Center that is called Poder Militar, Military Power, and looks at the advance of the role of the military in the society, in Mexican society. And there's consensus among experts that it would probably have to be gradual. One reason, because the police are not in a condition, because of the corruption, to take over those tasks, and also because people have become accustomed to the presence of military. But a real roadmap for that demilitarization is very, very important because of the amount of violations of human rights that this has caused and that it creates. The feminist analyst draws a clear link between the military model and violence against women. We're seeing more guns in the country, whether legally imported through sales. There's a new report out on that, or the illegal trafficking over the border. And although this is an area they always talk about addressing with the US government, we have not seen positive advances. The fourth are the social programs that we talked about. They're very important for the root causes. Again, they're long-term. They have to be very directed. They have to be analyzed and evaluated constantly. We don't know yet what the impact has been. Obviously, there has not been an impact so far on the violence levels, but they're still an important part of the equation. The justice system clearly has to be revised. There's some things happening. There's more action in Mexico against money laundering and white collar crimes, but there's a long way to go there. And Mexico needs a clearer policy. Well, I just want to finish up by saying that it's important to remember that there's light at the end of this tunnel. Many of you will recall a time when we didn't have these problems of violence. It's not that it didn't exist, but it was nothing like it is today. The homicide rate actually per capita in Mexico was one of the lowest in the regions, and drug cartels operated, but without the involvement of violence that affected civil society to the degree that we're seeing now. There was extortion, but again, it was at much lower levels. So the positive aspect of this is the fact that the violence is a direct result of a public policy, which means that there's a possibility to turn it around, not in the short term. Things have changed. You know, we're not in the same situation we were in before the war on drugs was launched, but there is a possibility to turn things around. And a lot of that has to do with what peace workers have stated over and over again, that ending war is really building peace. And that means that much of those tasks have to do with the kinds of things that you people are already doing and your neighbors are already doing. The creation of the mutual aid societies and the rapid response to COVID, advocacy efforts, community building, grants to youth at risk, opportunities for youth and for women's organizations. The Mexican government needs to recognize and incorporate these actions as part of its security strategy, because otherwise they're treating us as the sheep that are set out to be protected by the military wolf. And that's never going to work. The true strength of peace building and breaking these terrible cycles of violence that we've been seeing actually lies in us and our capacity to build community and to demand social justice. Thank you very much for the time. It's always a pleasure to be with you, and I look forward to discussions or any comments you might have.